LAPD Sergeant Athena Grant once said, "When we say protect and serve, we mean the community, not ourselves." And while these words of wisdom simply came from a television show, it's true. The community is the priority in the job description of a police officer, and the people must believe and trust in them. However, according to Pew Research Center in September of 2019, 61% of adults believe that police officers act unethically at least some of the time, with 1/6 of that number believing they act unethically all the time. What this shows is that while we as the public may trust them as a force, we also view them as a force to be reckoned with. What this tells us is that there must be changes made to our police system due to racial bias, both conscious and unconscious, as well as institutionalized bias within our system. With that being said, there are now only questions left to be answered. How is our system broken? Why is our system broken? And what can be done to fix it? Because it is imperative that we feel safe around those that are meant to be that protective hedge. So first, we will talk about the problems, both conscious and unconscious bias, as well as institutionalized bias, before moving on to solutions in both the legislative and communicative worlds. Inaugurally, let us discuss what is perhaps most obvious, echoed especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, which states that the force itself is racially biased. And while there are both conscious and unconscious biases, it is important to note that they both fall under the same umbrella of appearance bias, which, according to UF Library and Cambridge University, describes the roles of biases against a citizen's physical appearance. Firstly, racial bias can occur as a result of conscious bias, which is bias that is aware and intentional. It is an attitude towards something that is linked to the correlating actions. According to the U.S. Department of Justice in 2016, when a Baltimore police shift commander created an arrest form for loitering, he had to fill out an arrest template with identifying information on the suspect, including the arrest data, location, and the suspect's name and address, but does not include a prompt to fill in the race or gender of the arrestee. Rather, the words "black male" are automatically included in the description of the arrest. He was arrested for, as an officer of the law puts it, being a black male. This is simply one force, but it shows you the attitude that our American safety has, the demographic they believe will be the perpetrator. That lack of a duty to fill in the race and gender columns instills a habit in them to simply assume what group of people will be responsible for committing crimes. However, alert and conscious bias is not only a problem in the city of Baltimore. Coming closer to home, it was discovered by National Guard Sergeant Valerie Deont that within the North Miami Beach Force, during their extensive time in firearm training, they use mugshots of African American men for target practice. One of those individuals was Deont's own brother. This ultimately sparked the hashtag #UseMeInstead movement, in which clergy from the area sent in photos of themselves asking to be used in lieu of the other men. How would you feel if you saw your sibling, or your best friend, or your parents' photos nailed to a wall, riddled with bullet holes as someone repeatedly fires shots at it? Of course, there is the question of what this does to your mind, but what about theirs? We worry about kids being desensitized to violence by playing video games, and it's true. According to Andre Dowsett and Mervyn Jackson of the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology University in Australia, the competition of these violent games increases aggression. It is no different with the police. They should be equipped to handle a situation with force, if necessary, but they absolutely cannot spend 60 hours of firearm training competitively shooting at a certain demographic. Repetition creates habits, and a habit to shoot at a certain group of people is detrimental, not only to the victim, but the person behind the gun, as well as the rest of the force. However, alert and conscious bias is not the only type of racial bias seen in society. Racial bias can also occur as a result of unconscious bias, which is bias that is unaware or performing without realizing, which, according to Unleash Potential's founder, Maurice Whelan, is harder to identify. And though it is harder, it is not impossible to find. Josh Carell, a University of Colorado Boulder psychology professor, tested police for racial biases through a shooting simulation. And his initial findings showed that officers generally did a good job of avoiding shooting unarmed individuals of all races. However, when shooting was warranted, officers pulled the trigger more quickly towards Black suspects than white ones. This tells us that officers do exhibit some racial biases in shooting. Carell even responded to the experiment stating, "We have reason to believe that their training will fail them." However, their failure does not only affect them, it affects the victim, the people around the scene if they shoot before they think and someone is injured as collateral, and the community, if they unintentionally go after a certain type of person and leave the real criminal on the streets. So now we know that the foundation of their training is rooted in bias, but how did it begin? How did the police force grow into what it is today? The police have almost invariably been corrupt since the beginning. Early in our history, the profession wasn't a profession at all. Rather, it was seen as a punishment of sorts. People would get put on the job and patrol for the night. And for a long time, the government played only a small role in our criminal justice. One of the first major instances, according to Columbia Law Review, was the governmental military response to the Whiskey Rebellion at Secretary Alexander Hamilton's urging. Early in our history, through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the 1960s, the police were simply horrible, cruel to anyone who did not look like them or act a certain way. And it is not only individuals with this dismal point of view. According to PBS News, the KKK has infiltrated the police force. And these are people who are not only against those of color, but Catholics, Jews, and foreigners. According to the same source, they were even known as the Invisible Empire back in the 1920s when their numbers initially ballooned. Of course, they are meant to stop people who are acting a certain way, but they are not meant to be targeting certain demographics. And we cannot let them, as people with honor, morals, and a perception of what's right. Today, we've learned that there must be changes made to our police system due to the systematic failure that comes from personal bias, broken training, and a long history of sins from the force that have led much of the community not to trust them. What should be introduced? Firstly, we need resolutions that pressure units to change the ways in which they train. Rather than spending such a large amount of time on firearms, they can spend more time community policing, mediation, so that they're training not only to shut a person down, but to diffuse a situation. Outside of legislation, units can hold events like barbecues so that they get comfortable and get to know the people that they are meant to be protecting. Although one bad apple shouldn't make the whole orchard rotten, we must do our part to let the force know that not all of us feel safe and that their system is fractured. We must pressure them to fix themselves before their failure turns into the community's downfall. Thank you.